All right, ladies and gentlemen. All right. This lesson is on critical reasoning, and we're only doing three and a half hours of critical reasoning a day. Why? Part of how I could shrink this down a little bit is, so I've done much longer critical reasoning videos on the GMAT Club YouTube channel. And we can kind of get super granular about saying like, hey guys, I'm going to spend an hour talking about weakened questions specifically, or assumption questions specifically, or boldface, or fill in the blank, or whatever you want, right? And be super, super, super granular about it and just overdo it. Part of why I chose not to do that, yeah, we're limited to only 24 hours. That's not what I'm going to be saying about 15 hours from now, but that's part of it. But it's also, as I kind of thought about like, what is it we really want you to do on critical reasoning? How do we want you to think about it? What are the mistakes we see people make? So again, theme for this whole crash course is, what are you doing wrong? What are the common study mistakes? What are the things people do that get themselves into trouble? And one of them on critical reasoning is you over-memorize, you overstudy, you kind of go, oh, for this granular type of question, I'm going to obsess over this particular technique and memorize these steps. And it's like, that's not where most errors come from, guys. Like, that's not what I see. It's not what I see on the forums. It's not what we see with our students every day. Most errors come from misreading or come from overthinking or kind of taking something from the outside and putting it in there, right? And it's not specific to the question types, really. It's much more, hey, your overall process, your hygiene is a little bit broken. And you're maybe taking the passage for a walk a little bit in some way. Either. Okay, back to critical reasoning. If you've watched my previous critical reasoning videos, I talk about sort of a simple basic approach, nothing fancy. If you've got a passage with a conclusion, look, don't overthink it. Don't go down the road of like all these different tricks and diagrams and all that. Just think, hey, I'm laughing at Maria. How much of a donation does she need to make the stories nice ones? All the stories are nice, Maria. I don't have any blackmail on you. So critical reasoning, what I always want you to do, super simple. The goal here is don't misread. Get the logical structure of the passage, get it in their words. It really is that simple. It is not easy. It's super hard to do, but it really is that simple. And if you're doing more than that, you're probably overcomplicating things and you get yourself into trouble. So step one, basically, I'm just going to get the logical structure. And nothing fancy there. All I'm really mean with that is get the heart of the passage. What's the conclusion? Let's say it's a type of passage with a conclusion. That's all we're going to focus on in this lesson. So this hour is going to be all things with a conclusion, and your approach is the same. So strengthen, weaken, assumption, evaluate the argument, find the flaw, all of those. What is the author's argument? Let me get that conclusion. Their words are my words. Actually, I'll put it over here. 80%, 90% of errors I see, both in the forums and in real life working with students, it's this. So they say, oh, this is what it's saying. Great. And it's like, no, that's not what it's saying. That's what you paraphrased it into. That's what you wanted it to say. That's what you turned it into. But you tweak a couple words, you're in trouble. My textbook examples that you may have heard before in other videos. Oh, think about a conclusion that says X is a good solution to our problem. Applicant lab is a good solution to our problem. Applicant lab is a solution to our problem. Applicant lab is the best solution. Applicant lab is the only solution. Those are four totally different statements. To strengthen that, weaken it, find the assumption, find the flaw, whatever. Totally different with that one word. You miss those modifiers, those little words that tweak your strength or your scope or your magnitude or your number or have a comparison in them. And there's obvious ones, never, always, only, that kind of thing. But there's also far less obvious ones, right? Insurmountable, correspondingly, things that tweak the language a little bit. Don't drop those. The reading habit, the single most destructive force in critical reasoning, you drop a word in that conclusion on these kinds of questions, that's when you're toast. Step two, just ask yourself why or how. So basically, what's the author's reasoning? And just make sure you're not taking it for a walk. So their words are mine. Very simple approach, nothing magical there. It's not like this is going to revolutionize your life, but it's getting the right things in your head. I don't need you memorizing a ton of things. That's not what I'm after here. It's just making sure that you're doing everything humanly possible to build in precision. Get the logical structure. Think about what that heart of the passage is. In this case, conclusion in this hour. How'd they get there? Their words are mine. Don't take it for a walk. Hard skills to build. That's part of what I was arguing in previous hours. Start with reading comp and critical reasoning. Don't let those wait until after you've crammed a whole bunch of quant and sentence correction. It takes practice, takes a lot of focus. And I'm not going to mess around. I'm going to give you much harder questions here right out of the gate. So I'm going to start off with one of my favorites. Has some birds in it. Tough question. So the distribution I'm seeing from the people who are weighing in live, pretty good mix of, I think I've seen all five answer choices pop up in the chat so far, which is great. A lot of you guys are getting it. A lot of you guys aren't. Fantastic, normal, really tough question. Again, what I'm focusing on here is how do you, all 3 critical reasoning lessons today, how do you clean up your process? How do you make it nice and crisp? Get rid of all the junk. Get rid of all the, I'm going to memorize this technique and that technique. Keep it simple. What's the conclusion? Let's start there. Nice and straightforward on the passage, right? So conclusion is basically just that last line. So if warming continues, the Guillemots, I'll say G's range. I'm going to deliberately do something bad here, just to make a point. I could just say the Guillemot's range will be enlarged northward, let's say. Okay, so if I was working with a one-on-one student and I said, hey, usually I like to see what they give me, right? I mean, same thing I'm doing to you guys. Like, I want the feedback. I want to know what you're answering. I want to know how you're thinking. So same idea here, with critical reasoning, I'll say to a student, like, what tell me what's going on. Tell me about this passage. And, by kind of the end of the first half hour doing some of this stuff, they'll be like, well, the conclusion is this. Now, if they give me this, the Guillemot's range will be extended northward along the coast. I'll say with a very blank look on my face, their words are your words. And what do you think? What's the crime I've committed here? Bunch of them, right? Number 1, there's an if in there. If the warming continues. So that conclusion that we're trying to weaken, same would be true if it's a strengthening question or an assumption question or whatever. It's very different if it's a conditional statement. So if this happens, here's what will occur. Very, very different. Can't drop that. Probably be enlarged by extending northward along the coast. What's my point? Do these things matter in this particular question? Maybe, maybe not. That's not my point. It's that this is a really bad habit of mine to drop those things. I want you to really fight for that precision and to really think about, okay, hey, when I say their words or my words, I'm not joking, it needs to be their words. I need to think about how that fits in the rest of the passage. How'd they get here? So what's the why or the how or the evidence? Well, okay, so they need 80 snow-free days in a year to raise their chicks. So great. And previously, was limited to the South Coast. I'll say southernmost. Okay, so take that moment every time, whether you do it in your head or whether you do it on the page, doesn't matter to me. Take that moment and go, okay, let me make sure I got their conclusion in their words, not my words. If I start dropping words, even if they're not consequential, oh, you're right, I probably do need to line my camera. Consequential in this particular passage, that's okay. I want you to get the habit of mind of being really precise and ask yourself their words or my words and make sure I don't drop stuff there. Let me pull the question off the screen. Second, let me make sure I understand how they got there. So why is the author saying that forming continues, the range will be enlarged northward along the coast? Well, they need snow-free days. So if they have more snow-free days because it's warming, they can move further north. And second, we need to know that there is space for them to move. They're already on the southern end of the coast of the coast. So there's room for them to roam further north. Okay, great. So which of the following, if true, most weakens the argument? And by the way, one thing I want you to be conscious of here too, and I realize I'm spoiling a little bit of the surprise, just because something isn't directly part of the evidence doesn't mean you could ignore it. That's the other thing I'm doing wrong somewhat theatrically right now. It does say one other thing, good to have in mind. They feed on fish that gather beneath thin sheets of floating ice, and they nest on the land. Is that really part of the evidence to support that conclusion? Not necessarily. Does it feel like a distraction? they don't really put a lot of stuff in these questions that's ancillary, guys. Like they don't put a lot of just extra stuff for no reason. That's one of those myths I see. Occasionally you got something that's not super useful, but it's pretty rare that there's anything in there that you don't, that isn't at least somewhat useful. So make a note of it. Is it directly the evidence for supporting this conclusion? No. But yeah, they told us that for some reason, that this type of bird feeds on fish that gather beneath thin sheets of floating ice. All right, keep that in my mind, right? It's probably not just a distraction, probably. All right, answer choice A, if the warming trend continues, there will be years in which guillemot chicks are killed by an unusually early snow. Well, it's hard to see what that would have to do with this. The fact that there are some years in which some chicks would be killed by an unusually early snow wouldn't necessarily change whether their range moves upward. So that could happen whether the range moves northward or not, right? So that's not something that's going to weaken the argument that their range is going to be enlarged. So I can cross out A for that reason. B, if the Arctic warming continues, guillemot's current predators are likely to succeed in sending their own range farther north. Well, sure, that doesn't necessarily mean that the guillemots can't. Will there be predators chasing them? Sure, that's how nature works apparently. But that doesn't mean that they won't extend their range. Just because they're predators wouldn't, you have to assume a lot of things to assume that would prevent them from extending their range just because of the presence of predators. So B's not going to weaken that really either. What about C? Guillemots nest in coastal areas where temperatures are generally higher than in inland areas. Well, that's fine. Notice the language very carefully here, northward along the coast. So that precision that I'm barking about nonstop, as you digest the conclusion and try to make sense of it. Yeah, if you drop that part, you might make a mistake with C. But here it's like, yeah, no, that doesn't affect it at all. So just because they nest in coastal areas where the temperatures are warmer has nothing to do with it. If there's warming occurring, they're moving along the coast anyway. So that definitely doesn't weaken it. D, hope we like one of these last two, or else I'm going to feel really silly. If Arctic warming continues, much of the thin ice in the southern Arctic will disappear. Well, there's a temptation to say, who cares? But let's think about that a little bit. Classic GMAT. So if the warming continues, the ice in the southern Arctic, in general, is going to disappear. Then what happens? No ice, no fish. So that second sentence of the passage, they feed on fish that gather beneath thin sheets of floating ice. So if the ice melts, no fish underneath that floating ice, no floating ice, nowhere to hunt. So that definitely weakens it. What's going to happen to their range if they don't have any food? They can't expand anywhere. They're not eating. I'm going to hang on to D. What about E? The fish that guillemots eat currently are preyed on by a wider variety of predators in the southernmost Arctic than they are further north. Variety of predators doesn't matter. That says nothing about whether they can survive in different latitudes. So it's not E, and D is our winner. Okay, I'm eyeing the clock here a little bit, you guys. So we've got about 40 more minutes for this lesson, if I'm not mistaken. What I'm going to try to do, I'm going to give you a nice little variety of kind of these questions that kind of the theme here is these are questions that have conclusions. Second hour of critical reasoning, which we're doing in hour number 7, we're going to focus on kind of more of sort of those more dispersed ones. So a little bit of fill in the blank, a little bit of boldface, a little bit of accept questions, kind of those smaller things that show up less often. So we're going to do kind of a bunch of different question types here, but here's my point. Your fundamental way of reading it is the same. Read with precision, get the conclusion, their words are my words, get the reasoning, their words are my words. And then make sure you're using cross-elimination. Don't fall in love. Really, really easy to do and say, oh, B's the answer. Don't really read A, C, D, E. Problem. All right, next one. All right, mostly seeing agreement here, which is good, I think. Applicant lab hat. Won't see him in baseball caps very often. Works weird with a headset, but again, Maria, thank you so much for donating. Okay, so I'm getting a lot of questions about this. This is an LSAT question. And is it perfectly exactly the same as the GMAT? Not necessarily, no. But here's what we find over the years that correlates so strongly. What's the LSAT about? Read carefully, read with structure, don't fall in love with answer choices, make sure you're treating each answer choice equally. GMAT, same exact thing on critical reasoning. Almost without exception, we see, if the correlation between GMAT performance and LSAT performance and critical reasoning reading comp, phenomenally tight. There are certain question types you see on the LSAT. There's a lot of kind of, which of the following principles, if applied, blah, 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 blah. Very, very rare on the GMAT. So I don't necessarily put a lot of stock in those, but on something like this where it's just an assumption question, yeah, absolutely. This is something you should be able to get. Same exact technique, same exact style for the most part. Sometimes the LSAT's a little bit denser language-wise, but that's good for you. It makes you better at kind of powering through these things. All right, we're talking about a museum. There's a hippo. Conclusion. Pretty easy one here. The hippo was a religious object. And I suppose we can argue here, like, should that that other part of that conclusion, far from being a toy, should that be in there? We can debate. Put it in there if you want. So definitely not a toy, far from being a toy. It was a religious object. Well, why? How'd they get there? So earthenware hippopotamus, they admit that that resembles a child's toy. Found it upside down with its legs broken off. So interesting turn of phrase here. We know, pretty deliberate on the author's part generally. We know that the ancient Egyptians, I'm just going to abbreviate it as AE, believed the dead had to wage an eternal war with beasts. That sounds terrible. That's such a downer. Like if a church was like, "Hey, come to our church. We're gonna teach you that in the afterlife you're gonna be waging war with beasts all the time." I'd be like, "I want to pick a different church. Not really into this." And breaking the legs offer representation. Of an animal was thought to help the deceased person in that war. So there you go. There's your evidence. So the conclusion is it's a religious object, far from being a toy. Why? We know what the ancient Egyptians believed. We know that they believed the dead had to wage eternal war with beasts. Terrible. Also know that breaking the legs off was thought to help in war by the ancient Egyptians. Okay, so what assumption do we need? Again, assumption questions. There's so much craziness around assumption questions where there's like, oh, use this technique, that technique, different charts, different things you can draw out. Negation technique, I'm not a big fan. The reason why, not everything can be negated very cleanly. Sometimes if it's a complicated sentence, there might be 3 or 4 ways to negate it. Which part do you negate? Do you negate 2 of them, 3 of them? Does that have to be an odd number? Your brain starts exploding. It's impractical. Very, very simple way. So logically, negation makes sense. A very simple way I want to handle this, which is just to say, look, the assumption is something that reinforces or strengthens the conclusion, allows us to draw it, and it's necessary. That's the only thing that really makes it different than strengthen, is we need it. Without it, we can't draw the conclusion. I like to think about it in a nice, simple way. So yeah, people will kind of say it fills the gap, right? Like way, way, way back in the day, I worked for a big test prep company, and they gave me a script 20 years ago and said, hey, go read this. And yeah, we'd kind of say, hey, find the gap. But where I want you to be really careful, you can pre-think yourself into oblivion here if you're not careful. You can kind of hallucinate what's in the gap. And then it gets really, really hard to evaluate what's actually the answer choices. If an assumption question is any real difficulty, you won't anticipate it. You're not going to see that answer coming if it's a question of difficulty. Will it happen on easier ones? Sure. Will it happen sometimes on harder ones? Sure. But the best assumption questions, yeah, that answer flies out of left field. And you need to evaluate them in isolation and go, does this connect? What does this do? What does this answer choice do? What does it do? Does it strengthen? Does it weaken? Does it do nothing? Is it something I need? Is it something that I don't need? And think about it in that pure of a way. It's the cleanest way to do it. It's hard. It's less satisfying than some gimmick where, the company I used to work for taught us to draw this little graph. It didn't help. It didn't help you understand what was happening. It was just a cute little graph. That company no longer does GMAT, by the way, so I'm not knocking them. Wonderful experience there. All right, which of the following is an assumption required? So once we add it to this, that assumption we add in, we're going to need it in order to draw that conclusion. All right. A, the tomb in which the hippopotamus was found was not the tomb of a child. You definitely don't need to assume that in order to draw that conclusion, because this could still be true if it's a child, right? So the dead, deceased people had to war eternal war with beasts. That wouldn't necessarily change that it's a religious object. If it's a kid in there, they might still need this upside down broken hippopotamus to fight beasts in the afterlife. That's really weird, but okay, we'll go with it. So A isn't something you need. B, earthenware figures were never used as children's toys in ancient Egypt. You don't need to know that either. So it could be that it's a toy also, or that sometimes these earthenware hippopotamuses are toys. That could very well be the case. But we don't need to assume that it was never the case in order to conclude that this one, with its legs broken upside down in a tomb, can still be a religious object. We don't need to know that it was never used as a toy in order to conclude that this one was a religious object instead. So B is out. C, the tomb in which the hippopotamus was found was not re-entered from the time of burial until archaeologists opened it. This one's kind of tempting, don't you think? Because it kind of feels like you have to assume that nobody messed with that hippo. What if it was a toy and it was in there and it was intact, and then somebody went in and broke it and turned it upside down? So this feels important. I'm going to hang on to it. Feels like we need to know that nobody messed with it. And you'll see. We'll come back to that in a second. But yeah, feels good. C seems really logical. Yeah, nobody messed with the tomb afterwards. D, the hippopotamus's legs were not broken through some natural occurrence after it was placed in the tomb. This one kind of feels, I'm not saying it is, I'm saying it feels a little bit like C. We've got to assume the hippo wasn't broken by some other occurrence. Yeah, I think we kind of do have to assume that, right? Because if they were broken for some other reason, then it's not fulfilling that role of being the broken animal that helps you in that eternal war against beasts in the afterlife. So I'm going to hang on to D as well. E, the hippopotamus was originally placed upside down in the tomb. I don't know what that has to do with anything. Get rid of E, because the focus here is on breaking the legs is what helps you in war. Back to C and D. And I think I saw a fair number of people picking C, I think, on the forums as well. So when you think about D, do we need to assume that it was not broken later? We need to, so in order for this to be true, that this was a religious object, it has to be true that they broke it, given this evidence, that it was broken deliberately. That has to be true, or else this whole thing breaks down. So what D is saying is it was not broken deliberately. It broke through some natural occurrence. Got to assume that didn't happen and that it was broken deliberately. C, the tomb in which the hippopotamus was found was not re-entered from the time of burial until archaeologists opened it. Notice that does not connect to breaking it. Just because nobody was in there, that doesn't necessarily matter. It matters whether the legs are broken, not whether it was disturbed. Very, very easy to make the assumption that, yeah, if nobody was in there, it wasn't broken. What we care about is whether they were broken by some force other than the people that buried the dead person. And C doesn't actually do anything with that. So C is out. D is our winner. All right, I think we got time for two more here. Once again, my beautiful hat brought to us by Applicant Lab. Free trials, good stuff. Let's talk about herbs in this next one. Seeing some good disagreement on this one means I picked a good hard one. Also makes me very, very happy to see. So GMAT Club Legend, who's in the chat with us, Shovik 101990 on GMAT Club, went and got his MBA already, and he's answering the questions with us. And I am going to pick on you so hard, Shovik, when you get them wrong, just because that's fun and I love you. By the way, Shovik's the guy that introduced me to Maria at Applicant Lab. So thank you for that, Shovik. Again, Maria, thank you again for sponsoring, and love it every time I get the chance to pick your brain and hear what you have to say about admissions. Applicant Lab, some of the best out there. Okay, got a cultivated herb, part of a group of plants, blah, 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 blah. I'm going to cut straight to the conclusion here. The herbs. So the one herbs. Hi. I'm going to pronounce it histidine. I don't know if that's right. Histidine production must be, ooh, look at that language, the key feature. Allows it to grow in metal-rich soil. Okay, again, what I always want out of these lessons, so we can sit here and say like, oh, well, I'm gonna study the living crap out of this question. I'm gonna be better for it. It's like, that's not my point at all, right? It's what are the things that when you see a question on your actual test that obviously you've never seen before by definition, like how do you have good habits? How do you build good habits of mind so that you're more likely to get it right? That's what you're after here. If you're obsessing over explanations, talked about this in hour number 3, not going to help you a whole lot. So again, I'm really after that. When you get that conclusion, you ask yourself, their words or my words, are you noticing those little tweaks in language? Not an accident. Must be the key feature. Is that going to be the thing that this particular question hinges on? I don't know. But you should catch it. That should be the habit of mind. Some other question, that little difference, you drop that particular phrase, you're in trouble on a different question. Maybe you're on this one too. Who knows? Okay, so we're saying that the herb's high, that's hard to say, herb's high histidine production must be the key feature that allows it to grow in metal-rich soils. What's our evidence here? Well, we know it's a group, kind of background, right? It's a group of closely related plants that grow in soil with high concentrations of metal, toxic to other plants. It's kind of background. I'm not saying ignore it. I wouldn't necessarily say it's the direct evidence, but don't ignore it. It's kind of what's on that last question, right? Is it an extra piece of information? Don't just gloss over it. Acknowledge kind of what it's doing there. Agronomists studying the growth have discovered it produces large amounts of histidine. We already know that, right? So we know that the herb produces high amounts. Just say H. And in test tubes, solutions, the histidine renders the metals chemically inert. Okay. And I'll say in here also, so thrives, and really if we're being technical about it, saying one of many plants. So one of a group of closely related plants. That thrive in these soils. Okay, so always take that moment. Again, I'm not ever going to need to write all of this down. Taking notes, and I'm not going to talk about it a ton today, but talk about it in some of the other critical reasoning videos. Everybody's different. I think it's a problem to write this much down. I do it for the sake of going through the example, kind of showing you what's in my head as I go through it, what I think roughly should be in your head as we go through it. If you're writing this much down, you got a problem, right? You shouldn't need all this. Now, if it helps you to write down just the conclusion, just as a BS test to make sure that you're actually getting everything that's there and not jumping words or skipping stuff, dropping key modifiers, great. If that's something that helps your habits, wonderful. Doing this is obviously overkill. But just so we know what we're talking about, take that moment at the end. Conclusion, this herb's high histidine production must be the key feature that allows us to grow in these metal-rich soils that are toxic to other plants. Why? We know this herb produces a lot of it. We know that it thrives in this kind of soil, just like a group of closely related plants. And in test tubes, the histidine renders the metals inert. Great. Okay. And we want to know what would be helpful to determine. Notice the process of breaking down the passage. And again, this is where most of the money's at, right? It's the passage. Most mistakes come from the passage, 70, 80, 90%. Something you missed. It's not usually the logic of the answer choices. Sometimes, but it's minority of the time. Same as it would be for a strength and weakener assumption. Same exact process. So in evaluating the argument, it would be most important to determine which of the following. Do we need to know whether the herb can grow in soil that does not have high concentrations? Who cares, right? That has nothing to do with whether the histidine, our conclusion is limited to the histidine, whether that production allows it to grow in the metal-rich soils. Doesn't matter if it can grow somewhere else. That doesn't help us figure out whether the histidine is allowing it to grow in these metal-rich soils. B, whether growing the herb in soil with high concentrations of metals will over time reduce their concentrations in the soil. I don't think we care at all about the remediation of the metals or dropping the amount of metal that's in the soil. That has nothing to do with it. We just want to know if the herb's histidine production allows it to grow in those soils. So B is out. And Shovik, womp womp. C, whether the herb's high level of histidine production is associated with an unusually low level production of some other amino acid. Absolutely irrelevant here. Who cares about some other amino acid? It has nothing to do with what's going on. D, whether others of the closely related group of plants also produce histidine in large quantities. This feels irrelevant, right? Because the conclusion is talking just about this particular herb, right? This herb's histidine production is the key feature. But wait a minute. Think about everything else we know here. So it's one of a group of closely related plants that thrive in the soil that kills other plants. And we want to know about the histidine specifically. Well, if these other closely related plants also have high histidine production and they also live in the same soil, that helps indicate that the histidine is the reason why this plant can survive. So it gives us evidence about the histidine production specifically. So for that reason, we can hang on to D. E, whether the concentration of histidine declines as the plant approaches maturity. Absolutely nothing here about young versus old in the plant. So we can get rid of E. Tricky one. But are you having fun? All right, one more, and then I think we're going to be coming up on the bottom of the hour. One of the things that always fascinates me in these live events, it was interesting to see sort of the first wave of people, saw quite a few D's in there, and then kind of the next wave, it was kind of A's and D's, and the next wave I started to see more C's. And I'm not saying like the faster people are necessarily better or worse, right? It just depends on the question, but it's really interesting. Like something's happening, like the people who are processing quickly get to one answer, and the people who aren't get to a different answer. And sometimes it means that the ones who are processing too quickly missed it. Sometimes the other way around. This caused a lot of damage. That's fantastic. It means I picked a good one. All right, let's break it down. The percentage of flight delays caused by airline error decreased significantly this year. So again, these logical flaw questions, again, we can get into all this mumbo jumbo about, oh, you should draw this kind of picture or whatever. That's cool if it's your thing. But I'm taking a nice simple approach. I don't need a lot of complicated stuff. I just need to go, all right, well, what's the conclusion? Pretty simple. And I'm getting tired enough that I almost wrote the word consultant instead of conclusion. Hour number 5, 19 to go. What am I saying? Preventable delays are clearly decreasing. Okay, well, the question is, what's the flaw in the reasoning? So what's the reasoning? Well, okay, so the percentage of flight delays caused by airline error are down significantly this year. All right, great. And then that actually leads to kind of this, again, don't need the jargon, but intermediary conclusion, right? So this was kind of the starting premise, if you like the term, but fact stated by this airline representative guy. And then says, okay, so the percentage of flight delays caused by airline error decreased significantly this year. So percentage of the delays that were caused by the airline went down. So this indicates basically that airlines listen to complaints and address the problems. Okay. Listen to complaints and address problems. I should say complaints about preventable errors specifically. And address the problems. All right, so yeah, although delays caused by weather or other uncontrollable factors always part of travel, the preventable ones are definitely decreasing or clearly decreasing. Interesting. All right, okay, so what's the flaw in the representative reasoning? We want something, again, it's not like it's a little bit different than weaken, but it's pretty subtle, right? So instead of something we add in that weakens it, it's pointing out the flaw that's already there. Is that a big deal? Not really. I don't think that causes anybody a whole lot of trouble. A, airlines might be motivated by financial concerns to underreport the percentage of flight delays caused by airline error. This one actually sounds pretty good to me. And one of the things you'll hear me say a lot on verbal is sound has nothing to do with it. Might be motivated by financial concerns to underreport the percentage. Where do we have reporting in here? This one's great if we know, or arguably great at least, if we know that the airlines are the ones doing the reporting. That doesn't say that at all, right? it just says the number of preventable delays, and then it kind of talks about sort of these other delays that are inevitable, but it says nothing about the airlines reporting it. So A has nothing to do with it. That's not a flaw. So we can get rid of A for that reason. B, the delays caused by uncontrollable factors could have led to an increase in complaints to airlines. That sounds pretty good too, I think, in a way, and I think we had some people pick that. The delays could have led to an increase in complaints, but so what? That's not a flaw here. So if there were more complaints, yeah, well, the airline's listening to them. It doesn't point out a problem with the conclusion, right? The airline's addressing it. Wherever those complaints are coming from, it doesn't really matter where those complaints are coming from. The airline representative's argument is that we're addressing them, preventable delays are decreasing. This is definitely not a flaw. C, complaints may not be the most reliable measure of how many errors occurred in a given year. Well, this isn't something that's relevant either, right? What the representative is saying is that we responded to complaints and then addressed the preventable errors. But it's not, the argument isn't equating complaints with the errors. It's talking about errors over here. Complaints are a thing we address. Because we address it, it leads to a decrease in those errors. But C doesn't make any sense. Like, that's not actually an issue there, because the airline representative isn't suggesting that the complaints themselves are a measure of the errors, treating them separately. D, delays caused by weather and uncontrollable factors could have increased dramatically during the year under discussion. To be honest with you guys, first time I saw this question, I kind of dismissed this one out of hand and just kind of said, yeah, who cares, right? Like, we're focused on the ones that are preventable. The thing I've been barking about this whole hour, well, one thing I've been barking about is applicant lab is great. Go talk to Maria. The second thing I've been barking about is technique, right? So don't take the passage for a walk. Their words are my words. Their words are my words. Little thing here, percentage of flight delays caused by airline error decreased significantly. Doesn't say the number of errors. It says the percentage of errors. So what if there were a whole bunch more weather delays and the same number of avoidable errors? So if the airline's preventable errors stayed constant, but we had a whole bunch more weather and other uncontrollable delays, then yeah, your percentage of flight delays caused by airline error might go down, even if the raw number stays the same or goes up. And then this guy's whole argument is garbage, right? The airline might not have improved at preventable errors at all if the evidence is just the percentage of those errors caused by preventable stuff went down. So D is actually a pretty big flaw. If there were a whole lot more delays due to other things, then this number doesn't mean what the airline representative is claiming that it means. Oh, subtle, nasty. Hanging on to D. And I'm seeing the light bulbs go on in the live chat. I love it. E, airline customers might not believe that particular delays were caused by uncontrollable factors rather than airline error. Nothing here about what they believe to be true, right? Nothing to do with that at all. I think he's probably one of the easier ones to dismiss. This is a tough question. Everything I've done in this session, all four of them, these are tough, 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 tough. So if you're going for that 40 plus score, like let's say that, I mean, this would be a total abuse of data. But if I could see the few hundred people we have watching this right now, and if I could see your answer sheets on this, and let's say I gave you 2.5 minutes to each question, if I were to see you getting all four right first time you see these questions, I'm super impressed, right? Like, that's a really, really, really good sign, because these are tough, all four of them. If you're getting 1 or 2 or 3 right out of the 4, and especially since I'm cutting the time off a little bit for some of you, don't be embarrassed by that, right? Like, I think all 4 of these questions are sort of at that level where if you're getting 1 or 2 or 3 right, you're not necessarily in bad shape. I'm not necessarily worried about your ability to get to kind of that 40 level on verbal at some point. My big point here with kind of this blob of questions, strength and weaken assumption, find the flaw, evaluate the argument. What is the thing that I see people doing that's a real problem is you're getting too fancy. You're trying to do too much with the type of question. And it's like, hey, these guys have conclusions, all of these question types. And this is the vast majority of the questions, the critical reasoning questions on the test. There's got to be a conclusion. Don't overthink it. Get that exact conclusion. I'm going to pop something on the board real quick. So I know it's not showing up super great because it's sort of landscape versus portrait here. These are stats from the first 2 MBA.com tests, the 2 free tests, otherwise known as GMAT Prep Tests 1 and 2, default GMAT Prep exams, whatever you want to call them. So BB over at GMAT Club, our dear founder, Did an autopsy on the GMAT prep tests, and here's what you see for distribution of questions. Kind of starting from the bottom, working your way up, strength and weaken assumption, all three of those. Find the conclusion. Don't take it for a walk. Be precise. Find the reasoning. Boldface, sometimes we'll talk about that next critical reasoning lesson in hour number 7. Evaluate the argument. Some of the complete the passage, you need to find the conclusion. There's the ones that are just conclusion, logical flaw. My point is that a huge proportion of GMAT critical reasoning questions, more than half, there will be a conclusion. Get that conclusion, be precise, get into that habit of mind of saying, I'm going to make sure that I've got exactly their conclusion. Their words are my words, their words are my words. And sure, some of these get tough. Like some of these answer choices fly out of left field, which is what made these 4 particularly difficult. But I want you to really focus on get that hygiene right, get that process right. Push yourself to not drop words, not drop modifiers. That's what's going to do you right in the long run. That's what's going to maximize your score. Everyone's different in terms of their ability levels in reading itself. But over time, that's what's going to make sure that you don't miss any of those questions that you're perfectly capable of getting right. All right, that is it for this one. Critical reasoning, lesson 1. All right, thank you so much for watching, everybody. Hour number 6 coming.